Okay, well, I'm going to kick it off for those of you who have joined so far. On behalf of the Harvard Club of Southern California, I want to thank you for joining us in this Harvard Speak LA virtual event. The Harvard Club of Southern California is one of the largest and most active Harvard alumni clubs in the world, and we're delighted to be able to sponsor this event. My name is Neil Morganbesser, and I'm a Harvard College class of '86 and the director of the Harvard Speak LA program, which brings the opportunity to the broader alumni community for some intellectually and academically stimulating interactions with some of the most stellar Harvard faculty members. In 2025, Harvard Speak featured Harvard professors on California wildfires, extraterrestrial intelligence with Avi Loeb, the demise of Jim Crow with Randall Kennedy, civil discourse at Harvard with Ned Hall, America's governing crisis with Theda Skocpol, the latest developments in genetics with Joel Hirschhorn, Shakespeare and Marlowe with Stephen Greenblatt, and fairness in the workplace with Iris Bonnet. In 2026, we hosted Dr. Robert Waldinger on What Makes Us Happy, Harvard Mansfield on Conservatives at Harvard, and Cass Sunstein on The Nudge. Today, we're extremely excited to be able to hear from Professor Martha Minow, who's the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard. She's taught at Harvard Law School since 1981 and served as dean from 2009 to 2017. An expert in constitutional law and human rights, her work is focused on issues of exclusion and discrimination, legal responses to social, political, and religious conflict, and legal treatments of communication and new technologies. Her books include Saving the News, Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve Freedom of Speech, When Should Law Forgive, In Brown's Wake, Legacy of America's Constitutional Landmark, Partners Not Rivals, Privatization and the Public Good, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence, and Making All the Difference, Inclusion, Exclusion, and American Law. She's the chair of the board of Massachusetts Public Media, GBH, and co-chair of Access to Justice Project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Minow serves on the boards of many other philanthropies, including the Carnegie Corporation and the SCE Foundation. She's also a board member at the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan organization devoted to strengthening electoral and voting processes in the U.S. She previously chaired the board of directors for the MacArthur Foundation, the Revson Foundation, the John F. Kennedy Library Profiles Encouraged Selection Committee, and she served on numerous other boards, including the Legal Services Corporation and CBS. Her honors include a plethora of Lifetime Achievement Awards and 10 honorary degrees from schools in 3 different countries. Professor Minow's teaching over the years has positively impacted thousands of students. Most famously in 2008, when campaigning for president, Barack Obama said, quote, "When I was at Harvard Law School, I had a teacher who changed my life, Martha Minow." And it should be noted that the SS Minow in Gilligan's Island was apparently named for Professor Minow's father. Professor Minow is currently working on a new book about the preconditions needed for a sustainable constitutional democracy, and so it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Minow to hear her speak to us about Not Born in Democracy, Predicates for Constitutional Self-Government. Professor Minow will speak, and then we'll do Q&A. If you have questions, you can submit them via the chat, and we'll take them after she finishes her presentation. Again, thank you, Professor Minow, for joining us.
Thank you, Neil. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to see you all. And I can't help but say hello to Jim Geocaris. This is a treat. I am indeed writing a book. I've sent it to the publisher, but it's not too late, so you can save me from mistakes. The book is called Not Born a Democracy, and I will talk about it here with you. In barely over a week, our country will start the celebration following the anniversaries of the Declaration of Independence, then the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. 251 years ago, as the battles began, Harvard students were let out early. Winter classes moved to Concord, along with the library and even a clock used for astronomical calculations. 1,600 troops moved to live on the Harvard campus to help fortify Cambridge and Boston. Turns out they stripped the roof of Harvard Hall for metal that was used for bullets. And in 1778, Harvard successfully petitioned the Commonwealth for payment. Harvard then paid Concord a bit for the trouble of housing the Harvard students, and 8 alumni signed the Declaration of Independence. The celebrations are underway right now. And yet, all around the country, indeed around the world, many people wonder whether the system of government and the rule of law ignited 250 years ago will survive current political assaults. The Gallup polling company reported yesterday that 77% of Americans polled think the founders would be disappointed with how the country has turned out. Are we losing our democracy? Asked the editorial board of the New York Times. Speech stifled by the president and his allies, persecution of political opponents, congressional authority sidelined, the military used for domestic control, defiance of court orders, declaration of national emergencies, vilification of minority groups, all raising warning bells. Masked and unidentified agents abduct and detain individuals, including citizens, from their homes, schools, and public buildings in the name of immigration law enforcement. Daily events trigger alarms. We see repeated threats by government to control information and news media, to take over universities, to dismantle environmental, public safety, and anti-discrimination laws, and to use political power for personal profit. Reflecting on how did we get here leads me to look to the beginning. What ingredients, what preconditions, what investments does a constitutional democracy require? And here's my working conclusion. Self-governance requires setting up and maintaining institutions that enable participation and check power. Self-governance requires cultivating and sustaining individuals' capacities, abilities to listen, to collaborate, to engage in political actions advancing not only their own interests, but also those of their communities. Polling places, city councils, legislatures, courts, and administrative agencies alone mean nothing without the participation of people bringing their commitments and skills. David Brooks has a piece in a recent Atlantic making a similar point. Certain qualities of character are necessary. But self-government also requires renewing and protecting the rules of the game for clarity, for fairness, for preventing capture by corruption or authoritarianism. Here's a small joke about democracy to make the point. I taught my kids about democracy tonight by having them vote on what movies to watch and pizza to order. And then I picked the movie and pizza because I'm the one with the money. Sad to say, this hints at the spread of the problems of corruption that we currently see. Historically, societies embracing ideals of democracy started far from it. Ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the early government in the United States confined self-government to an exclusive elite, depending on coerced labor of other human beings, and so-called constitutional democracies have engaged in empire building and corruption, violating their professed values. The problem for constitutional democracies is not the occasional emergence of demagogues. Every age produces them. The deeper challenge comes with destruction of the practices and institutions that provide accountability and that grow a sense of shared fate for people living in a society. Individual leaders and their supporters accumulate personal power and wealth, and when they do so, they hollow out democratic institutions. Modern authoritarians in supposed democracies cast doubt on or hijack elections and sources of reliable information. They appeal to people's anxieties. Currently, an issue in many parts of the globe, this also is a problem, of course, right here. When he was Secretary General of the United States, Kofi Annan observed, "No nation is born a democracy." And that's the phrase that arrested my attention. People are not born knowing what democracy, freedom, or justice are or what they require. American writer James Baldwin stressed that these ideals require enormous and, above all, individual effort to arrive at the respect for other people that these words imply. The work of self-governance over time depends on participants informed, committed, and secure enough to participate. So I've identified 4 preconditions, maybe 4.5, that require continual investment. The first is education for democratic engagement. The second is reliable sources of news and information. The third is day-to-day security against violence by guns or threats. Certainly a problem for everyone, but can be a problem for judges and other officials. And finally, reciprocity, through which people take turns and adhere to norms, enabling political and economic systems to work. As I said, maybe it's 4.5 because the additional half is to elicit people's endorsement and respect, the reciprocal commitments and norms. Those norms and the related laws must be perceived as fundamentally fair and not manipulated to benefit only some. We have contemporary roadblocks for all of these preconditions, and some of them come from judges interpreting the Constitution. U.S. courts have repeatedly rebuffed efforts to secure federal constitutional rights, including a right to education. Meantime, despite individually excellent schools, many schools across the country fail to provide even minimally effective instruction. And nationwide, test scores reveal stark failures. Judicial understandings chill responses to the perfect storm we have of legal, technological, and financial disruption to what were once vibrant newspapers and magazines, generating misinformation and disinformation, threatening access to reliable information, preventing a shared reality. We have a crisis in the news area. Death threats against judges and actual violence against leaders manifest distrust, polarization, and desensitization. Since 2020, gun violence has been one of the leading causes of death for the youth of this country. Majorities across the country favor restrictions on firearms, but the courts, relying on the Second Amendment to the Constitution, strike down restrictions on sales and uses of gun. One was struck down just today. In addition, the Supreme Court grants seemingly limitless immunity for the president. It has disabled checks and balances, curtailed congressional support for voting rights, and limits on gerrymandering, campaign finance, and incumbent advantages. No wonder large swaths of the American public think the system is rigged. A majority of young Americans believe that our democracy is failing or in trouble. Their doubts echoes doubts raised in the past. General George Washington, before his presidency, returned to his plantation in Virginia after 8 years of war. And he wrote in a letter in 1786, and I quote him, "I am told that even respectable characters speak of a monarchical form of government without horror. What a triumph for the advocates of despotism to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves and that systems founded on the basis of equal liberty are merely ideal and fallacious." His concerns remain relevant and point to investments required to prevent despotism and enable democracy. I'm going to talk about those 4 preconditions a little more in detail and then really look forward to your comments. Let's start with education. It's important to any society, but it's critical to a democracy. Successive generations need to develop skills and attitudes necessary for self-government. Those include understanding the duties of participation, taking an interest in the well-being of others, and no less important is learning to collaborate and to manage emotions in the midst of disagreeing. Harvard and other campuses are grappling with ways to promote these capacities among students. It's really a task for universal education and for students much younger than college age. More broadly, education, whether in families or communities or in schools, should help young people learn to assess information, to develop values, debate, listen, take on responsibilities en route to the roles of adulthood. Education for a constitutional democracy needs to cultivate students' abilities to discern what information is and is not reliable, who is reliable and who's not reliable, in trusting where information comes from, how to distinguish conspiracy theories from evidence-backed information. Teaching can help. An analysis of 252 educational interventions in 17 countries shows that correcting exaggerated stereotypes reduces support for undemocratic practices. Teaching can help. But teaching students and testing them on what they've learned can easily turn into imposing officially approved views. Indoctrination differs from education by restricting questioning and independent thinking. Guarding against indoctrination means teaching self-reflection, teaching critical thinking. Best practices feature students' own views and arguments while ensuring exposure to contrasting viewpoints and cultivation of analytic skills. That includes questioning and challenging what texts say and what the teachers say. Currently, in many American communities, the aspiration to promote civic engagement and debate is jeopardized by the so-called culture wars. 19 states have adopted policies banning certain topics and viewpoints in schools. 4 others are debating them. And fights over these policies distract people's attention from really disastrously inadequate schooling in many parts of the country. The U.S. Constitution has no textual reference to education, leaves the subject to states and localities, and the states by now each have committed to providing students with education, but they differ dramatically in how many resources they allocate. This year, Idaho spent $9,387 per student, kindergarten through 12th grade, while New York State spent $33,437 per pupil. Inequities in educational resources follow zip codes and student family income. Public schooling is largely funded in this country by local property taxes that bakes in inequalities, and unequal resources correlate with race. Disparities in per pupil expenditures mean real stark differences in the rigor of the courses, the quality of instruction, the stability of the teaching staff, and chronic underfunding characterizes America's schools and as a whole. Despite excellence in individual schools and districts, the U.S. as a whole ranked 19th in science, 30th in math, when compared with the 35 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And schools largely fail to offer students the chance to learn alongside others who have different backgrounds and experiences. Racial and economic separation of students has increased 70% since 1991, according to Stanford scholars. Some students in American schools receive instruction specifically preparing them to vote and to engage in public governance, but many do not. When such opportunities are offered, they can be very meaningful. Students in Phoenix, Arizona, had the opportunity to participate in what's known as participatory budgeting, a process involving voters directly in deciding how the government should spend tax revenues. That is an unusual opportunity. In the United States now, only 22% of 8th grade students taking the National Assessment of Education Progress Civics exam reported to meet the standard of proficient. Only 1 in 3 adult Americans can pass the nation's citizens test for naturalizing immigrants. And in recent surveys, 17% of respondents could not name a single branch of the federal government, and fewer than 1/3 of American college students know that it is Congress that has the power to declare war, not the president. Educational opportunities matter to civic engagement, even in the face of severe adversity. The students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School organized nationwide for gun control after they survived a mass shooting that killed 17 of their classmates. And they drew on the lessons about lawmaking taught by one of their teachers. That's education. Second precondition I've already touched on is sustainable and accessible sources of reliable news and information. It was Ida B. Wells, American journalist, who said the people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. There's only one private industry that's mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, and it is the press. The Constitution gave Congress authority to create the Postal Service, and the very first Congress established discounted postal rates for newspapers and free mailing of newspapers between publishers. The founders knew the importance of such investments. They knew that the revolution and ratification of the Constitution depended on widely distributed news. During the 18th century, printed media became integral to British and American societies, and not coincidentally, ideas about freedom and popular governance and resisting tyranny circulated through independent and competing outlets. Journalists then and now investigate the conduct of governments, businesses, and communities. Newspapers, broadcasting, and cable have long depended on a combination of subscription and advertising revenues, all disrupted now by digital communications. Advertising has shifted to digital media platforms, and they do not reinvest in reporting the news. People regularly share journalists' copyrighted materials on social media without paying for their use. Resources for reporting are shrinking. The US saw a 75% reduction in the number of newsroom employees between 2002 and 2025. 1/3 of the nation's counties lack even one full-time journalist. CBS News has shuttered. The future of CNN is in doubt. Communities lacking local news see lower rates of voter turnout, higher levels of public and private corruption, and a growing number of American communities receive content generated by computer bots that obscure their sources. Digital enterprises, dubbed pink slime, these take advantage of the void in journalism, and they distribute unreliable content. Social media, YouTube, generative AI, together radically are changing how people get information, how it's produced. And at the same time, concentrated ownership stifles competition and variety. 6 media companies accounted for nearly all the news and information consumption in the United States last year. And that does not even include YouTube, the platform that dominates people's attention and again offers no investment of its own in journalism. All of this occurs as a U.S. president and his appointees berate and exclude journalists from covering the government, terminate aid for public media, and pressure journalists to tell only what the administration wants. Now, look, no one likes negative press. I know, I was a dean. But free speech and active journalism expose mistakes and keep those with power accountable. A 2026 research report from Sweden downgraded the United States in a review of democracies across the world, and did so largely because of suppression and intimidation of media and dissenting voices. Shouldn't romanticize the information ecosystem of the past. There's always been market dominance, coverage gaps, but where journalism exists, it protects freedom. And with sufficient resources, democracy flourishes. News coverage exposes misconduct and corruption and waste, and prompts people to depart from high posts. Active news reporting correlates even with reduction of toxic emissions, lower hospital admissions due to food poisoning, effective criminal justice reforms, and higher returns on community bonds. Information changes behavior. Freedoms of speech and the press enable a self-governing people to understand the needs and freedoms and interests of others, but none of this can work without protection against harassment. And that includes abusive uses of tax and criminal authority, threatened violence, something that's happening right now against journalists. Local news has performed historically another important function, which is reminding people how much we have in common, creating a sense of we, a sense of community. But now we have balkanized content and distribution that amplifies polarization and tribalism. False information generating a liar's dividend, containing even the difficulty of contaminating reliable information, producing distrust and disbelief. What can be done to rescue diminishing journalism? There's a lot that can be done, and it's consistent with the Constitution, although some make objections and say there can be no government involvement. Actually, the First Amendment to the U.S. that protects the freedom of the press and speech only forbids Congress from abridging those freedoms. It doesn't forbid any efforts to amplify them or to strengthen them. And that's what has been the case for centuries in this country, for 2 centuries. State and local governments have subsidized newspapers and communications technologies. Tax exemptions have been a major tool. The federal government has subsidized the development of radio, television, cable, communication satellites, the internet, and established and financed public media. Public media, already indicated, I have to disclose, I chair the board of a Massachusetts public media GBH, which produces Nova and Frontline and American Experience and Arthur and Antiques Roadshow. I became the chair, and 1 month later, the federal government cut off all of the funding. And right now, public media is struggling but surviving because it has always been mostly funded by philanthropy, by private individual contributions, individuals and collective philanthropies. Uh, in addition, I think there are promising innovations. 20 American cities now have a program to pay local residents to attend local government meetings and take notes, pose questions. AI is being used to record some public meetings and make the transcripts available. Philanthropic donors are investing in existing and new journalism under the banner of an initiative called Press Forward. When I chaired the MacArthur Foundation, this was a priority, still is. Coalition of Philanthropies have donated nearly $500 million since 2023 to support local news. And federal and state and local governments could do more. Public media, I've already said, is doing its best. It depends on private support. Strengthening reliable news sources will in part be possible if there's greater demand. And that, I think, calls for media education, call back to the education topic. In addition, there's much that could be done voluntarily for the digital platforms. They could develop their own tools to help users identify what's reliable and what's not. And it matters to everyone's daily life and health. Do you remember the lead in the water in Flint, Michigan? It was exposed by local media. The risk that arose after the city's government tried to cut costs by switching from its Lake Huron water source to water from the Flint River. But that source contained toxins that made people sick. Local media learned about it, and ultimately national and global press investigated and educated policymakers. The pediatrician who helped break the story, Mona Hanna Atisha at Michigan State University, documented how children's lead levels doubled and in disadvantaged neighborhoods tripled the city's average. I had the chance to talk with her, and she scared me very much by explaining, in her estimation, there are hundreds of Flint, Michigans out there with contaminated water. We were lucky, she said, to have local news covering our crisis. People's actual health and the health of a self-governing democracy require ongoing investment in reporting and trustworthy news sources. My third precondition for democracy is security. Of course, any government's function must include providing for the safety of its residents. A constitutional democracy has to, for its own legitimacy, and has to ensure that there are paths for security-related measures that people in the society believe are necessary. A government that itself commits violence, unchecked by legal rules, puts its people and its own existence in danger. When the U.S. Customs and Border agents shot and killed Alex Preddy, the second U.S. citizen in Minneapolis killed that way earlier this year, officials defended the action initially by noting that Preddy brought a gun to the protest. Unusual political bedfellows came together. Opponents of the Trump-era immigration raids and gun rights advocates joined in a public outcry. And the government killing of a citizen exercising rights of speech and assembly outraged some. Others objected because government officials justified killing someone because he was lawfully carrying a gun. Evidence from video recordings of witnesses show that the agents, in fact, disarmed Preddy and then shot him. The large number of lethal weapons circulating in America jeopardizes everyday safety and trust in government. The prevalence of guns exacerbates risks of suicide and increases credible threats in the midst of anger and frustration. Over 80% of the murders in America involve guns. My hometown of Chicago, community peacekeepers in Chicago, the people working to prevent gun violence, have themselves been shot. Nearly 79% of adults, almost 80% in the United States, report they are stressed because of mass shootings. Many shy away from certain places or events as a result. The students on campus during the shooting last December at Brown University Several of them had survived high school shootings, one of them from the Parkland, Florida shooting. One later told the press, "The one thing that gave me comfort was, like, statistically, it's practically impossible for this to ever happen to me again. And clearly, we're getting to a point where no one can say that anymore." The shooting of state representatives in Minnesota, the assassination of an influential conservative speaker on a university campus in Utah, the attempts on the life of President Trump, candidate Trump, political violence is on the rise. And dueling narratives about guns make it difficult to reform the laws about guns. One narrative presents the unparalleled high levels of violence involving guns. I've already contributed to that narrative here. But for many, guns and the right to possess them represent freedom and security. Some say guns equip people to defend themselves and to confront an abusive government. But for many people, it is the plethora of privately owned guns that represents ongoing threats to security. There are popular images of gunfighting in the 19th century frontier settlements that exaggerate their prevalence and underplay how many gun regulations existed then. Defenders of gun ownership stress guns don't kill people, people kill people, and their opponents can respond. Doesn't easy access to guns have something to do with why so many Americans are injured by guns? The nearly 4% rate of gun deaths out of 1,000 people in the United States is more than 8 times as high in our neighbor Canada and more than 100 times higher than in the United Kingdom. Gun lobbies funded historians and lawyers who litigated and helped then to establish the Supreme Court's ruling that the Second Amendment right to bear arms is a right held by individuals. And on that basis, the court now has struck down many, many gun regulations. A critical comma sits between the two sections of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. And it's on the basis of that comma that many, many pages of scholarship have been spent. Does it give a right to individuals or only to militia? The court 5-4 in 2008 said yes, it gives a right to individuals. And ever since then has directed all the courts in the country to look at what were the laws in 1791 in order to find what's lawful now as a restriction and what's not. The High Court here in Massachusetts looked recently to practices in the 18th century and struck down a 67-year-old ban on switchblades. A federal judge in California looked at history and tradition and ruled unconstitutional a 100-year-old state ban on billy clubs. Judges now have to spend time in time travel, basically, to evaluate the constitutionality of bans on assault weapons and ghost guns. It's just not clear to me what 1791 experience can tell us about guns produced by individuals using 3D printers and instructions available on the internet. Ronald Reagan's appointee to the bench, Judge Harvey Wilkinson, observed that assault weapons designed to kill people rapidly, many people rapidly, are not our forebears' arms, he said. These are not our forebears' calamities. He reasoned that decades of legislated regulations demonstrated, and I quote him, "The amendment has not disabled the ability of representative democracy to respond to an urgent public safety crisis." And yet the Supreme Court is turning now to 1791 analogies to try to figure out when a regulation is permitted. Most Americans favor gun control, and that includes members of the National Rifle Association. And many communities have adopted some regulations, but many of those are being struck down as unconstitutional. And this problem, in part, reflects actual structural problems in the way our electoral system is designed. The Electoral College, the way that districts are gerrymandered, allows the combination of minority power in the Electoral College and the Senate to actually stymie not only legislation, but to control who gets appointed to the courts and who gets confirmed. There are things that can be done. I think about an analogy to actual reduction of car-related deaths. It was design changes in auto design that actually made a difference. We could have changes in the designs of guns to make them safer and make it more difficult to shoot out of an emergency feeling or loss of control. But a deeper problem in this country is the fear. The number one reason people say they want guns in the United States is that they need it for self-defense. That has replaced any other purpose, whether it's hunting or recreation. We seem to have a paranoid style of American politics, and many of these fears are race-related. Black people are 3 times as likely to be shot by police when compared with the shootings of white individuals. And racialized patterns also reflect the deployment of violence by border security. Recent mass shooting incidents apparently grew from fear that white people will be replaced by racial minorities. And so building bases for trust, including the overcoming suspicions and strengthening emotional self-management and problem solving, may be pivotal. Maybe even more important than gun control laws. Takes me to my final precondition, reciprocity and opportunity. By this, I mean cooperation, including respect for election results, general trust in social and political institutions, and that means having a basis to trust them, having political and economic institutions that engage in fair play and are perceived to do so. But we have deficits in all of these areas. Democratic practices in society need reciprocity. They need people's willingness to work together, to take turns, to recognize others. Consider the example of accepting election loss. Doing so is a predicate in a constitutional democracy. Losers refusing to accept losses signals a crisis. Widespread doubts about election results in the United States stem largely from concerted efforts to challenge the 2020 presidential election and perpetuate lies about who won. No court in the 60 cases brought to assess whether there was fraud found serious fraud. And overwhelming majorities of voters across both parties viewed the 2024 election as fair and effective. And yet, more than 2/3 of Americans worry about democracy's future. And Republicans and Democrats both report that the candidate from the opposing party is a threat to democracy. It is a basis to worry all of us that denial of the 2020 election result is a touchstone for hiring by the current administration. It should worry all of us. Accepting election results matters to democracy. Political scientists tell us democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. That's the definition. That means that members of the parties and their candidates have to accept losses. And of course, this is the basic lesson of every athletic and game practice, every competition. Every generation has to learn to accept disappointment, to learn from loss, to prepare to try again. Winning does not determine self-worth. These are the tried and true lines of advice from coaches and experienced players in games ranging from soccer to chess to video games. Follow the rules, demonstrate generosity towards your competitors. This is what game theorists, historians, parents teach. And denial of election loss is a symptom of a larger failure, a failure to see one's long-term self-interest connected with the interests of others. Cooperation stems from awareness that we're all repeat players. Building patterns of reciprocity now helps next time around. And indeed, this is the lesson of one of the important accomplishments during the first administration of President Trump. The administration successfully enacted the First Step Act 2018, directing the Department of Justice to develop a system for assessing recidivism So each federal prisoner has a chance to reduce their sentence, earning credits by completing assigned tasks and learning how to move from prison to home confinement or a reentry center. Negotiation over this and other features of the law broke a gridlock that had prevented criminal law reform for decades. Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, and Brooke Larlins from the Office of American Innovation of the White House achieved the deal by working alongside advocacy groups reflecting diverse political affiliations and formerly incarcerated people. Kushner, whose own father had served prison time, later described the lessons he learned as really you have to reach out and talk to the other side and recognize that no party has a monopoly on good ideas. Cooperation is essential. And yet right now we're living in a world in which resentments are so profound that people feel that they're playing the sucker if they cooperate, playing by the rules that they have not made. People feel that they're disrespected. They're taken for a ride. They're distrustful. They're demoralized. They feel exploited. And that's why I have this maybe one half more precondition that the systems have to be fair, have to be perceived to be fair. The social, economic, and political arrangements, they have to not give rise to the widespread view that people have in this country now that it's all rigged. And then, fortunately, there is evidence that it is rigged. The ways in which incumbents, elected representatives, redesign the rules to benefit themselves. And by that, I mean gerrymandering and also stock trading, campaign finance rules, helping those who are already in power. And when it comes to employment, selective university admissions, historic patterns of exclusion, and also race-based affirmative action meant to correct the exclusions have both contributed to perceptions that the systems are unfair. Harvard and Yale currently have only about 5% of their student bodies coming from the bottom 20% of the income distribution in the country. These are the kinds of facts that make people think that the systems are not fair. The framers of the Constitution anticipated corruption. They sought procedures for selecting leaders who were pursuing the public good. And there are things that we can do about that. We can have independent commissions, as California does, to design districts. We can have redesign of even the voting methods to make them more reliable. But it's like the old light bulb joke. How many light bulbs does it take how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the patient has to want to change. If society is the patient and democracy is what's ill, we have to want to change. It is hope that fueled American democracy from the start. The seeds of freedom and core values of self-governance are inspiring and remain so. 2/3 of Americans desire more diversity. Despite media amplified partisan or polarization, most Americans say in the end, we're all Americans. I genuinely care about all Americans, no matter what their political views. And so let me just close with that as a thought, and taking a page from the man who designed the Constitution of India, who said democracy is not merely a form of government, it's primarily a mode of associated living, a conjoint communicated experience. It's essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men, and it requires a struggle. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that. And yeah, if people have questions, put them in the chat. Let me kick it off. So thinking about your four part test here, is there one in particular that you think is the most critical? I started thinking, well, it must be education, but then you went to every one seems so significant and dire. Is there one in particular? And let me ask the flip side of that. If you had a magic wand and could change one thing, is there one thing that would be where you'd focus, or is it really just a compendium of everything?
So I don't want to fight the hypothetical. It's a great question. Maybe because I'm an educator, I lean towards education, but several of my students who helped me with the research for the book pointed out that these are all interrelated. That those attitudes of reciprocity and cooperation, hopefully that's what schools teach. Learning to discern what's reliable information and to want it. Schools, again, enough respect for one another that we don't resort to blows. Education seems at the core, but I think they're all interconnected. So thanks for the question.
Sure. Um, here's one from Mike Novikov. Of course, the American public's deeply polarized now, but it feels like the public was even more polarized with far less access to state-sponsored education and with very limited national conversation in the late 18th century when democracy was actually founded. Northern and southern states disagreed violently, not just over, and that's all I got. I have, uh, I have to move this. Not just over public policy, but also basic morality. It kept getting worse until an actual civil war and for 100 years afterwards. So, how did we get basic democracy off the ground back then? Is it possible we've actually changed the definition of democracy since the founding, maybe changed to something that far more folks than we want to admit were never especially enthusiastic about?
So a really fascinating question. One thing that is striking that even though education was only available to well-off people in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, education that we think of as learning from books and so forth, there was enormous circulation of news. And people would read newspapers, they'd read them aloud at the local pub. By some measures that historians have, there was more literacy in the United States and more reading of newspapers then than there was in England. So education of a different sort was very prominent and prevalent there. The divisions in the country that grew really later, it's really in the 1740s and 50s, much more that we started to have real divisions. And that in part is, of course, about slavery. The framers thought that slavery would go away, it would disappear. And, historians have identified how the divisions grew greater and greater over time with the fear that there was going to be some elimination of slavery. So polarization now versus then, hard to find measures that we can really make comparable. But I would argue that in the 1800, there was a big divide over the election who got to be president. But local governments were strong, newspapers were strong. Public education really got a lift off in the 1830s and 40s, and there was a lot of support for it.
Okay. Jen Cantor asks, how might we think of how rule of law might fit in? Would that follow from the preconditions that you listed? And can you talk about what defines precondition versus other types of conditions?
So another great question. In many ways, rule of law is threaded through all four, but it's especially in the last one. So I think of rule of law and the respect for the legal system as part and parcel of respect for one another, cooperation, following the rules, following election results. So I would locate it there primarily. And what's a precondition versus other kinds of conditions? I'll tell you, my publisher, University of California Press, is my publisher. They hate the word precondition. They don't want me to use it. So I'm experimenting, and I'll be interested in your thoughts with ingredient, investment, and I like the notion of a precondition because it's kind of a predicate. It's what you have to build everything else. As we've seen in Eastern Europe and we've seen in other parts of the world, you can have a beautiful constitution written down. You do not have a democracy if you don't have these other elements. And unfortunately, we're seeing this happen. We're seeing, Poland has had this. Hungary did until recently. Russia has a beautiful constitution. But if you don't have these elements of community engagement, widespread education, fair and free press exposing the lies of those in power, and physical security. I don't think you can achieve a democratic society and self-government. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Timberly Williams asks, thank you for your talk, Dr. Minow. Democracies often face the paradox of having to tolerate viewpoints that may ultimately seek to dismantle the democracy itself. Where do you think a democracy should draw that line, and who should have the authority to decide?
You guys are so smart. That's such a good question. I've actually grappled with it myself because the US, particularly on free speech, we're on one extreme. And if you go to Europe, and particularly countries that still have a strong memory of the World War II and Nazism, Germany has a law against political parties that seek to end democracy. Germany has laws that punish people for hate speech. Britain has laws that punish people for hate speech. France has similar laws. And so I don't think it's impossible to develop consistent with constitutional democracy some limits on speech. It is, however, not American. Our tradition is quite different. And, we may be testing the limits here because the free speech protections that have been recognized for the internet, for example, for internet platforms, I think are allowing a lot of dangerous information to circulate. I don't know if you have followed, but the algorithms that YouTube uses to recommend videos have been found to actually lead people to ever more extreme views. And particularly dangerous is for young men who are brought down to a rabbit hole of authoritarian videos. It's very worrisome. So I think the paradox of liberalism is often described as, is there tolerance for lack of tolerance? And, I think that there's a way to break that paradox and say, yes, there has to be toleration of intolerant views, but with a limit while protecting the system itself.
Is the flip side of that, should there be, I don't know, I don't want to say a religion, but a state-sponsored ideology that democracy is in fact a good thing? I mean, is that what is incorporated in your education of democracy, that
Yeah.
we almost have to have democracy because we want to have democracy? That's one of the reasons we should have democracy?
Well, it's one thing that I really grappled with, and it's why I added a discussion about indoctrination and the worry about the methods of instruction, not the content, but the methods that silence criticism. So it seems to me that cultivating appreciation for democratic values is fine, but not if it's done by silencing criticisms of it. And interestingly, in my own work on international human rights, you can imagine, because of my interest in education, I've been following the development of programs to teach young people around the world about human rights. And, beautiful curricula have been developed, sponsored by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. But studies show that when they are adopted and taught in top-down authoritarian methods, surprise, surprise, they're not very effective. So I think it's about the educational method more than the content. I think cultivating appreciation for the country and its traditions is fine. But look, we're having this play out in real time right now with two different commissions that are under assignment to help the nation celebrate the 250th. One was created by Congress 3 years ago, and it's nonpartisan, and it's bottom up, and it's funding local communities to do all kinds of things. The other is coming out of the White House, and it forbids discussions of race. It forbids discussion of anything negative in American history. We're seeing this fight right now. And what's very sad is that the very values that the country stands for are being violated in the second commission, it seems to me.
Great. My last question, unless anybody else has anything on the thread, then our last question. When you think comparatively and you think out there of other countries, are there any that either provide a good role model for where we are and I'm sure there are a lot that are bad role models for where we could be going, but are there any good role models that we can look to and say historically that's what happened there and it corrected this way? Or on the other hand, when you look out, are there any other societies that are surprisingly doing it really well now?
Surprisingly, Hungary, I think, is a place to look right now. I have a friend who lived in Hungary for quite some time. I have actually three friends who lived in Hungary, and I've been talking with them a lot about how did the electorate recently reject an authoritarian leader. And it's a complicated story, but certainly it was helpful that his challenger was from his own party, was a conservative. It's kind of like when Richard Nixon resigned, it was people in his own party who went to him. But another factor is that actually there was an appeal in this recent election to what it means to be Hungarian and pointing to corruption and the corruption of of Orban and his regime really offended people. I have to say there's one more element that I cannot find an analog for the US, and that is membership in the European Union. So the European Union started to turn off the spigot of any financial support to Hungary due to its violations of free speech and fundamental rights. And that external pressure was powerful. I don't know what there is that we can point to like that.
Great.
Jim asks, when is the book coming out?
Yeah, I was gonna
Thank
say
you.
that's our last question, really.
How much do I owe you for asking that question? Well, it's at the publisher, but since it's a university press, it might take a while. I mean, I hope it'll be out early next year. Thank you for
Fantastic.
asking.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Dean Minow, for doing this. We really appreciate the time and all the insights. And the recording will be on the website within a week. So tell your friends and they can all listen in. But thank you so much.
And there's now Minnow. Thank you. Thank you all. Very, very nice. And
Have a
Jim,
good night.
really a treat to see you.